The theme for this week is becoming aware. In each week, we have been cycling between experiencing and experimenting, creating a relationship, and becoming aware. So what I'd like to do in this video is to preview the week's work, to talk a little bit about dialogue as a particular kind of conversation that you can use to raise awareness. And next, I'd like to speak about some things that can get in the way of being aware because they limit what we are able to perceive and how we are able to think about those perceptions. And finally, I'd like to talk a little bit about this week's experiment. Becoming aware is something that is addressed in the readings, the coaching session, and the experiment. Feedback and learning gaps are covered in the textbook. Review the material on providing feedback in that chapter, and the one that follows on collaboratively interpreting learning needs. The emphasis in the article that Mark Magerman and I wrote is about asking questions to raise awareness about experience. And the awareness that is desired is awareness about self and awareness about self in relationship to others. In the coaching session, you will be using the reading material to formulate questions that might help the learner to raise awareness. And finally, awareness will be a factor in the experiment that you do this week about advocacy and inquiry. So let's start with dialogue. Dialogue is like walking a tightrope where you're trying to maintain a balance between having a conviction and keeping an open mind. We are very familiar with advocating. We've been taught that in school from early on. It's about expressing and arguing for your point of view. And here are some things that you can do to be a strong advocate. You can share information, provide specific examples. Imagine how other people are responding to what you're saying. Put all your cards on the table. Make your assumptions explicit. Ask for feedback. Or actually surface what everybody needs from a solution before proposing a specific solution. Now, don't be concerned about capturing all of this information. In doc sharing, there's a handout on advocacy and inquiry. Inquiry, on the other hand, is all about asking questions. And these are some strategies that you can use for increasing inquiry. Obviously, questioning, asking others to share their point of view, or inviting them to share the thinking behind a point of view or conclusion. Inviting other people to question your point of view. Asking for concrete and specific examples. Or questioning the assumptions behind the other's point of view. Generally, in the spirit of inquiry, what you're doing is cultivating not knowing. Now, this slide shows different kinds of conversation where inquiry is low or high and advocacy is low or high. Look at chat. There's not a lot of advocating going on there, nor is there a lot of inquiring. Think about a cocktail party. In interviewing, on the other hand, there's a lot of inquiring because the desire is to uncover information. In debate, imagine a lawyer in the courtroom. The lawyer is called the advocate. He or she is making a compelling case for something and is involved in very low inquiry. In dialogue, both advocacy and inquiry are high. So go to DocSharing and download that handout on advocacy and inquiry. It's a tool that can be especially useful in raising awareness in groups. Let's move on to talk about some things that can get in the way of awareness. The concepts of introjects and projections come from Gestalt therapy. An introject is when I take in something from the environment and believe it belongs to me. Shoulds and rules are great examples of introjects. Children should be seen and not heard. If you don't have something nice to say about someone, say nothing at all. Now, some introjects can be positive. Don't touch the oven. The simple test for whether or not an introject is positive is whether or not the client is aware of it. If, on the other hand, the introject is in the unaware domain and it is driving action, if it's unexamined, if I don't even know it's there, it's not healthy, inasmuch as it gets in the way, or could get in the way, of having a satisfying life. It gets in the way of what we're able to perceive and how we think about those perceptions. So awareness is key. And the other element that is important is whether or not the person has chosen that for themselves. I'm thinking about a simple example here of a client that I worked with who had a belief that in the end, the best answer would win. And so he really had little value or understanding of the social and political aspects of how decisions are made, and believed that it was all about intellect, analysis, having the right answer. That belief had him. It was very difficult for him to let go of that. Let's move on to projections. A projection occurs when I take something that belongs to me, usually something that I have a hard time dealing with because it conflicts with my concept of self, and I project it onto the outside world. So the classic example of a projection is the preacher who is virulently anti-gay, who appears to be obsessed with homosexuality, only to be found with a male prostitute. Now, I'm not talking about the clergy person who believes that homosexuality is wrong, not the average clergy person who might have that position. Whether or not I agree with them, I can understand that that's a belief in their faith or in their interpretation of their faith. I'm talking about a preacher who appears to be on a crusade. A strong indication of a projection is the presence of a tremendous amount of emotion. Introjects and projections inhibit awareness because they filter what we are capable of perceiving. And they then influence how we're able to think about those perceptions. So let's talk a little bit about the experiment. In the experiment this week, I'm going to ask you to have a conversation with someone where you make an effort to balance advocacy and inquiry. If you're someone who tends toward advocacy, I'd really encourage you to experiment with inquiring. Alternately, if you're someone who favors inquiry, experiment with advocating. And then there's another question, and that is, do you have a belief, an attitude, or a rule about how to have a conversation that traces way back? Especially some belief about advocating or inquiring. So after you've done the experiment and reflected on this question, go to part A of the discussion and tell us what happened. And again, share as much or as little as you're comfortable with. That's absolutely up to you. Have a good week.